we look at aggregate supply, there are two different approaches or two different perspectives to take. When it comes to aggregate supply, those two different perspectives correspond to two different schools of thought in macroeconomic theory. The first is a long-run perspective, and that's more closely affiliated with what's called the classical school of economics. The classical school viewed the world through a long-run prism. Basically, they said that the quantity supplied of goods and services depends upon the number of inputs that we have, and to a degree technology, and that given enough time, those things will sort of fit together, and it will allow the economy as a whole to achieve what's referred to as the full employment or the natural rate of output. This is the output that occurs when all of the resources of an economy are being used effectively. That means that the aggregate supply in the long run will naturally trend toward a single point on the quantity axis of our aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph. And from there, the aggregate supply curve will simply shoot straight up in a vertical line, and that will be aggregate supply, regardless of what the price level is. Now, this is an important relationship, the fact that aggregate supply is determined outside of the scope of the price level, because it confirms what the classical school says, that real variables, in this case our output, won't be affected by nominal variables, in this case the price level. So the classical school views things from this long-run perspective. Now, that doesn't mean that the curve can't move. The long-run curve can absolutely move. If there is a significant change in the availability or the quality of inputs, or if some new technology comes on the scene to change the way we engage in production, that can shift the aggregate supply curve. So for example, if there is a change in the population so that we have more laborers, whether it's an immigration policy or whether it's changes in the birth rate, if we increase the number of workers, over time that's going to push the aggregate supply curve out to the right. Now, interestingly, it tends to be the case also that with more workers, we also increase the aggregate demand. We've got more workers, but they also demand more things. So over time, aggregate demand pushes out to the right as well. And we see that there's an increase in output and an increase in inflation. What's nice about this particular theory of aggregate supply is that it tends to be very accurate given enough time. Over the long run, we see that indeed outputs increase for economies, inflation does increase to some extent for economies, and this gives us a really nice picture of how things should work. However, not everything happens in the long run. That's a long period of time. Most of us live in the short run. We have day-to-day things that change the way we approach decision making. We have day-to-day events, day-to-day choices that have to be made. And so most of our lives happen in the short run. In fact, part of the Keynesian school of thought, started by John Maynard Keynes, was to change the direction economists look when they look at the aggregate supply. Keynes said, no, don't pay so much attention to the long run. It's the short run that matters. It's the short run where the fluctuations, the normal changes in the economy happen. So Keynes constructed a short-run aggregate supply curve that's upward sloping like the normal supply curves that we're used to looking at. In this case, we have the positive relationship between output and price levels. Keynes said that nominal variables can indeed affect real variables. It's normal to expect that because, for one reason, information doesn't flow perfectly and seamlessly through markets. And so the way that this is explained, this upward sloping supply curve, in the short run is typically based on that premise, that information is limited to the participants in a market. It doesn't get transmitted quickly enough for things to change rapidly enough for the economy to adjust in a very fast fashion. The short run curve also doesn't stay put. It can change for the same reasons that the long run curve changes. It can change for short-run changes in input availability, for technological changes, but it can also change as a result of changes in expected prices. Things that you think might happen, but you don't really see those things happening. They don't really come to fruition, even though you think they will. So we've got two ways of looking at the aggregate supply curve. There's a long-run view and a short-run view. Both have their positives to looking at them, and both have their negatives to looking at them as well. But these are two attempts to evaluate the way the economy functions and the position that an economy finds itself in at various points in time.